More and more people are considering moving abroad. In fact, according to the Harris polls, March 2025, it indicated that 4 out of 10 Americans have considered the idea of moving abroad. On the top of reasons for wanting to move abroad was the high cost of living in the United States, which includes healthcare, education, and housing. There's many reasons besides these that people move abroad. It can be related to war, it can be related to climate change, political uncertainty, but there's also some positive reasons. Some people want to move abroad to experience a new culture. Maybe they've found someone that they've fallen in love with that lives in another country and they want to move abroad. On the top of a lot of people's lists of possible countries that they might want to move to is the Scandinavian countries when you think of Norway, Sweden, Denmark. And why is that? Well, it's because of the high quality of life and the fact that they rank very high on a lot of surveys. I personally am an American who moved to Sweden 3.5 years ago, living here in the south of Sweden in Malmö. And I would like to talk about this topic because I've had a lot of people reaching out to me, asking me questions about the possibility of them moving to Sweden. And something that I've noticed out there on a lot of YouTube videos is people tend to glamorize the whole moving abroad and being an expat somewhere, maybe being some sort of digital nomad. And while there are a lot of cool things that are associated with moving to another country, there's a lot of things that people enjoy the novelty of: a new culture, new food, new people, new language. On the other end, there are some things that you need to be aware of. And so this video is not to bash on Sweden. In fact, I love Sweden. I'm very grateful to be here. But it is to give a more reasonable and more authentic answer to things that a person should think about before moving to Sweden. And everybody's experience is going to be very subjective. So for me, there are things that may be important to me that are not important to another person. So I'm basing what I'm saying, these top 10 things, off of my personal experience, what I've read, and what I've heard from other people that have also moved here. With that being said, let's get right to it. And the most common question I get from people since coming to Sweden is, why did I as an American move to Sweden? I won't answer that in this video. If you want to know more about that, feel free to look at some of my other content and you can find the answer there. With that being said, welcome to my channel. My name is Brandon, registered nurse from the United States, living and working in Sweden. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my video if you find this content helpful. So let's get to the top 10 things you should consider carefully before moving to Sweden. Number 1, the weather. The weather can be quite nasty for a lot of people that are coming from tropical climates. In fact, here in Sweden, there is a lot of variation. So Sweden lies a bit farther north on the globe. And so the farther up you go, the colder it gets, the more snow you get. Also depends if you live on the coast like I do. Where I live, here in the south of Sweden, it tends to be pretty mild. And we don't get a whole lot of snow, though we do get some snow. And it melts pretty rapidly. That being said, for a person coming from a warmer place, say closer to the equator, it can be quite a challenge when you're used to being able to go around in flip-flop shorts and a t-shirt all the time. A lot of Swedes, they complain about the weather here and can't figure out why a person like me would move to Sweden. Coming from Texas, the weather is very extreme. I come from the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas, and the weather could be very hot in the summer, 47 degrees Celsius, which is quite dangerous. And then in the winter, you can have extremely cold temperatures. It can drop way colder than this part of Sweden that I live. And then the next day, it could be all of a sudden warmer. It could be 20 degrees Celsius and then drop to -5 degrees Celsius within a matter of hours. That's why we have so many bad storms in Texas, such as hurricanes and tornadoes and hail. Here in Sweden, it's pretty stable and pretty mild. The summers are amazing where I live in this part of Sweden. In fact, I would compare it very much to the Los Angeles area of California, quite mild. There is a Swedish expression, det finns inget dåligt väder, bara dåliga kläder, and it means there is no bad weather, just bad clothes. So it is very important to make sure you dress appropriately because it makes all the difference in the world. Number 2, the long, dark winters. So this really varies from place to place here in Sweden. So the farther up you are on the globe, of course, the winters are going to be darker and the summers are going to be brighter. Where I live, and if you want to go on Google, you can find more specifics about this. Look up the city, look up the time, look up the day. You can see when the sun goes down and when the sun rises. And where I live in the winter, it tends to go down on the shortest day at about 4 o'clock-ish. and then it rises around 8 o'clock-ish. So you have a much shorter amount of daylight time than you do in a place, say, in Texas, where I come from. And this can really play with your mind, especially if you're used to a lot of sunlight. There is a lot of mental health issues in the wintertime, a lot of depression because of the darkness. And there are measures that you can take. So, for example, if you make sure you take your vitamin D, and this is a medical disclaimer, I'm not giving medical advice, this is purely educational, but it's very important you keep control of your vitamin D levels and follow up with a doctor. Having a social network is very important in the wintertime so that you can support each other, having plans, going out and doing things, getting involved in activities into the wintertime. Very, very important. Number 3, the privateness of the Swedes. The Swedes value their private lives. And to me, as an American, at first I found this quite therapeutic, because I found in American culture, as an introvert myself, I felt it to be a little bit too much for me sometimes and a little bit exhausting, and there was a lot of pressure for me to perform. You feel like you have to always be putting on your customer service friendly face to talk to people that you will never meet again. However, in Sweden, that is not the case, and I found it quite therapeutic in the beginning, but after being here 3.5 years, it has started to kind of wear on me a little bit. Now, people are people. They are very different, and they change from time to time. So you can't throw all Swedes or all Americans in one box, because within every culture, you have a lot of variation. So you will find very outgoing and very friendly Swedes, especially those that have had the experience of living abroad in other countries. It does change them a lot sometimes, and you may find them to be a little bit more outgoing. There is an illustration that compares Swedes to Americans. They say Swedes are like coconuts and Americans are like peaches. Americans are soft on the outside and hard on the inside, or in other words, it's easier to strike up a conversation, but hard to have a really deep, meaningful friendship. And then Swedes tend to be like a coconut, which is like hard on the outside, but soft on the inside. So it may be really hard. In fact, some people say it may take 10 years to crack the coconut, but once you get into the inside, they're very nice and soft, and you have very deep, meaningful friendships. Now, this is just an illustration, and it by no means the rule. There, of course, is a lot of variation among the two cultures. But a lot of people come to Sweden, and they come from lands where things are more open and more outgoing, and they find this to be a big challenge for them, and they may even find that they start to become isolated. And one of the big challenges to that also is the language. Even though a lot of people speak English here, if you don't speak Swedish, this can be a little bit isolating, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later on in the video about the language. In fact, the privateness of Swedish culture I find to be a little bit too much sometimes, and I know some Swedes will criticize me for this because they feel that this is a very valuable thing to them, and I understand that, but I do think there is some concerns there. For example, you can live in an apartment complex, and it is very common for people to look out the people over the door before they go outside their apartment because they don't want to come in contact with another person. When they're sitting on the bus, every single bus corridor could be filled, but there's like one seat next to each person. And then if you come on the bus, people get uncomfortable if you want to sit next to them. And if you go into an elevator and then someone else is coming, sometimes they won't want to take the elevator because they want to be in there with another person, so they take the stairs instead. And I think, personally, as an American who's been living in Sweden, I think I kind of sort of understand it, but I think it's a little bit extreme because there is, working in healthcare, I see a lot of mental health issues. I have a lot of patients that deal with isolation and depression. There have even been people in Sweden, and you can go and look at this. This is very well documented. This is kind of a dark thing. There have been people that have died in their apartments and been dead for years, and nobody knew because nobody knew their neighbors. That is a very extreme case. This is not the general thing. I don't want to paint a bad picture of Sweden, but this kind of stuff would be very hard to see in a place like, say, America, where, for example, if you're a neighbor and you see that your neighbor has not come out their house for 2 days, you're probably going to call the police and do a wellness check to make sure that they haven't fallen or gotten hurt. And so it's just something to be aware of. Is that something that will affect you? Are you a real outgoing person? And, you kind of get what you give too. With Swedes, you got to kind of take the initiative a little bit. And I have some amazing Swedish friends that I have very deep, meaningful relationships with. And, I think it's just one of those things that you have to put yourself out there and you have to try. And it's interesting too, because there are a lot of Swedes that their values of friendship and communication and interpersonal reaction are a little bit more in line with, say, someone like me that comes from a culture that's more outgoing, and they do feel a bit socially isolated. I was actually talking to a good dear friend of mine that I met when I first visited Sweden, and he's the nicest guy, Swedish guy, super humble, super kind, but that was something that he mentioned that he's been dealing with is this kind of issues with the Swedish culture. But then you'll find that a lot of Swedes, they don't have a problem with it and they value this. So you try to be respectful of their privacy and not try to force yourself on people. And, you search out those birds of a similar feather and flock together with them. Number 4, the taxes. Swedes, generally speaking, tend to be pretty proud of the taxes that they pay. A common thing that you'll hear is you get it back. So, for example, taxes subsidize things such as health care. They subsidize college education, sick days. So if you're sick at work or get an injury, then that's subsidized by the government. You also get 5 weeks paid vacation. If you're my age, over 40. If you're younger, you get like 4 weeks paid vacation. If you have children, there's a whole lot of benefits for your children. And coming from a culture like in America where people have to work 2 jobs to be able to make sure that they can afford daycare for their kids and health insurance and a house, I find this very nice, actually. However, on the other end, the taxes are quite high. So if you have certain financial goals and you're coming here starting from scratch, it can be a little bit discouraging because it'll be much more difficult to reach those financial goals. Like, for example, having a house if you want to live in a larger city, like here in Malmö, it's the 3rd biggest city. So I realized that in my current situation, I'm not going to be able to afford a house on my salary. Whereas working as a nurse where I come from, I didn't pay as high of taxes and my salary was higher, and so my money went a lot farther. In America, if you have certain types of degrees, you can actually get ahead in life. You can, you may have to take out a loan, but a lot of times you can make the money back. It depends on what you go to, because of course there's those degrees that you don't make a whole lot of money. But like healthcare with nursing, it's pretty lucrative career. And here in Sweden, it seems like a lot of the things you go to school for, you really don't make that much more money. And then once you get above a certain tax bracket, and they have tax brackets here, so you pay a certain amount based on this tax bracket, and then when you go up to the next tax bracket, the money that falls in that bracket, you pay a little bit more, and so on and so on. Now, I'm not a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, and I'm not a tax guy or finance guy. I'm real bad with this kind of stuff. I am a nurse by trade, so that's my specialty. But I hear a lot of complaints about the taxes, and I'm sure in the comments we're going to get some really interesting comments and probably some arguments about taxes here in Sweden. But one of the big things I'm concerned about is, are the tax dollars being used in a good way? And are we really getting all of our money back? There are people that have no children, never will have children, and maybe don't go to college. And so for them, maybe the only thing that they actually take advantage of is healthcare and sick days, but then they pay a whole lot of money and then they don't get it back. And, different people feel differently about that. Some people don't mind that. They feel proud about it. They feel that they're helping their fellow Swedes, whereas a lot of people don't feel that that's fair because they put a lot in, but then they don't get much back. And so it's going to vary from person to person, and everybody's got different opinions. So it's just something to think about, is the high taxes. And everything's taxed a lot. For example, coming from the States, where I come from, Texas, you don't have produce taxed. You can go buy fruits and vegetables for very cheap. Americans may think it's not cheap with what's going on, but when you compare how much it costs in America compared to here in Sweden, there is a big difference on how much vegetables and fruit cost in the grocery store. Whereas here in Sweden, they're already expensive, and then you pay a lot of tax on top of that, and you're already paying income tax. You pay tax like on everything, so it's just like you're taxed on top of tax on top of tax. And the thing I don't understand is the tax on healthy food, because you would think that you would want your citizens to be really, really healthy, and you would want them to eat healthy food. And so you would make it to where it's more accessible and easy for them so that they don't get sick and then they don't utilize the tax system so much. But who am I? Who am I to say anything? Number 5, I've kind of touched on a little bit. 5th is the cost of living here. So when I first came here, I was really excited because I thought, things are so much cheaper here in Sweden, like, for example, apartments. But then when you look at what your salary is, actually, the apartments are very expensive compared to what you're actually making per month. So your money doesn't go very far here in Sweden compared to somewhere, say, the United States, because in the United States, there is the opportunity, if you do get educated or you are talented or you start your own business and it's successful, you can buy a whole lot more with your money. Whereas in Sweden, everything is really expensive. I mean, even buying a container to put your food in and the refrigerator, like a reusable container, can cost 3 or 4 times as much as, say, from Texas. The apartment situation is very difficult, especially if you want to live in a big city. And for those of us that immigrate here, it's easy for us to come in the system those first few years if we're living in a bigger city. So we're kind of forced to have to live in these more expensive places to come in the system, and we're starting from scratch. So definitely something to think about. That being said, once you come into the system, if you were to, say, move farther north, you can purchase a house for much cheaper than many places in the United States. The United States is a big place with many states, so there's a lot of variation. So I'm going to say that right here before anybody attacks me in the comments about that. But if you're comparing like a city with the same population to a city with the same population in Sweden, I do think that once you move out of the big cities, you will find that you can get houses way much cheaper than you can, say, somewhere in a similar size city in Texas. So there are houses I've seen in Sweden up in the north that are the price of a car. That is pretty much unheard of in Texas with cities of the similar size. So that's kind of a nice little benefit. But then there are costs that come, of course, associated with living in a small city. You don't have access to a lot of things, which means you have to travel to do certain shopping, and you may have to pay higher prices to have things shipped to you. Bureaucracy is reason number 6. So things move very slow here at a snail's pace. There's so much bureaucracy. So for example, when I first came here, I had to get a tax identification number, and it took me almost 2 years to get that. If you don't have a tax identification number, it's extremely difficult to utilize the system and to come in and for things to work the way they should. So for example, a lot of people here use a thing called Swish. So if you go out to eat dinner, then maybe one person gets the bill, and depending on the restaurant, of course, and then everybody will Swish or send money for their part of the bill. And I didn't have access to Swish for the first 2 years I was here, so it was really difficult. People don't really use cash that often here. It's quite rare. So, you don't really want to have to go to an ATM, which is, to me, I always feel scared going to an ATM, like I feel someone's going to rob me. So it's difficult not being able to use the Swish system. Also things like getting a driver's license. I was allowed to take all the courses to drive in Sweden, but I couldn't take the test because I needed a personal identification number and I needed an ID. Couldn't get the ID unless I had a personal identification number. Getting an apartment's hard without an identification number. Getting healthcare, I had no healthcare. Despite working in healthcare, I had no access to healthcare, even though I was paying taxes because I didn't have a personal identification number. The exception, of course, is if I'm bleeding out somewhere, have a heart attack. Yeah, of course they're going to take care of me. But for chronic healthcare, no. Regular doctor visits, no. So the bureaucracy of things moves very slow here in Sweden. That's something you have to be patient with. So that's something that turns you off. Then maybe that's something that you really need to seriously consider. I like to joke and say that Sweden has kind of like island time, which is interesting because Swedes tend to be very punctual and on time, but when it comes to anything having to do with government or paperwork, it does tend to move at a snail's pace usually. Number 7, long wait times for healthcare. In Sweden, if it's acute care, my experience has been really good. I actually have been a patient in the hospital. I ended up with borderline sepsis. And I got right in. It was, a very quick experience. Overall, aside from being sick and not feeling good, it was a good experience. But when it comes to chronic issues or issues requiring a specialist, wait times can be very long. In fact, I have a paper here. I just received this. This is showing that I was given a wait time of 2 years. It says, för närvarande har vi en väntetid på upp till cirka 2 år. So currently we have a wait time of up to 2 years. And this is so that I can get a very important procedure done that can affect my life. So I have a wisdom tooth that is on the way to becoming infected. I have a hole and there is infection going on there. And I already had the wisdom tooth pulled out here on this side of my face. And I ended up with sepsis. Has nothing to do with oral hygiene. It was purely just I had impacted wisdom teeth, and you can't clean out there. Even though I was going and getting tooth cleaning, I developed cyst, And when they took out the tooth on the right side, I got really sick and I ended up in the hospital. And then that was in October. Now it's March 2025. And trying to get a referral, or they call it a remiss, from my dentist to the jaw surgeon was like literally pulling teeth. And so finally, after all these months, since October, now it's March, as I said, I finally got a referral sent. There was a lot of back and forth between the two. One saying, we need a referral from your dentist to be sent to us. And then my dentist says, no, we need a jaw surgeon to send us a letter requesting a referral. And there was a lot of back and forth, and this went on for months. Finally, I had my time with my oral hygienist, and that was a couple weeks ago. And then I brought this up again, and I said, I'm starting to have some discomfort there. And she's like, yeah, this needs to be taken care of as quickly as possible. This has gone on too long. And they sent a referral, and then I got this letter, as I just showed you, that the wait time for getting this tooth taken out is a wait time of 2 years. Thankfully, that's one thing too in Sweden. You got to know people. It's all about networking. And I know somebody that used to work for these people. And so she's trying to kind of help me out to get in a little bit quicker. I did tell them how serious my situation was, and I did manage to get an appointment at the end of this month. So in like 3 weeks, I do have an appointment just to be looked at, not to actually get the procedure. And so we'll see what happens. Number 8, finding a place to live in the city can be very challenging. For those of us that are immigrants, it's usually easier for us to move to a bigger city because we need access to a lot of government agencies. And so because of that, we need to find a place to live. There are people that wait for years in what they call queues or waiting lines to be able to get a certain apartment. I myself, to get this certain apartment here, I had to stay in a subletted apartment or underhand, so it was an apartment someone else had, and they were living abroad and they needed someone to live there. Thankfully, I found it through a Facebook group, and I was only allowed to stay in the apartment for 12 months because then they were going to be moving back. And then I had to find my own place. So I was on a wait list for 13 months before I could get this apartment. And then once it popped up, I had to take it. It was actually pretty expensive, but I had to take what I could get. It's like we say in English, beggars can't be choosers. And so, yeah, that is going to be a big challenge, is finding places to live in the bigger cities. Number 9, the language. This may come as a surprise because many have heard that English is widely spoken in Sweden, and that is true, but there is some exceptions. So, yes, Sweden, it has the second highest amount of English speaking as a second language per capita. But that being said, there are many people that cannot speak English, such as the older population. We also have a lot of people that have moved to Sweden from other countries that cannot speak English. And there are people that maybe speak limited English, as well as people who speak English but don't feel comfortable speaking it. Another thing you find is, as I mentioned earlier in this video, the culture in Sweden is very private, and so it may be very difficult to come into people's lives and make new friends, but if you speak Swedish, it makes it much easier to make new friends and come into their lives. In my line of work, I have to speak Swedish. It's very important. I work as a nurse, and so I had to do all my documentation in Swedish, and it's important that my patients feel safe. So if I cannot speak good Swedish, then that is a big problem. I've been living in Sweden for 3.5 years and speak fluent Swedish. It is an ongoing process and always will be because I wasn't born here. On top of that, there are different dialects. So I live in Skåne. Many joke and say that where I live here in Skåne, that it's not Swedish, that it's Danish. I personally find actually Skånska, the dialect here, quite charming. And I understand it. It was a challenge at first, but it is a doable thing. The dialect I find most challenging is actually Göteborgska, or the dialect spoken in Gothenburg. I actually work with a couple people from there, and they talk very fast, and they have a very unique betoning that I find quite a challenge for me. So, coming from the United States, where you can go to Oklahoma or New Mexico, a whole nother state, and the dialect doesn't change, and then coming to Sweden, where from city to city, dialects change very drastically, and they even have special words. They vary from town to town. Even among the Swedish people, sometimes they find that they have trouble understanding things that the other says. I've been in Gothenburg. I know people say this is just made up, but this is true. I have witnessed this. I took my friend who is from Skåne. We went to Gothenburg. We went to a taco restaurant, and the lady there finally told him she couldn't understand Skånska. She's Swedish, and she said, "Can we just speak English?" So that will be a challenge as well. Swedish is a very unique language with tones, and the way that you say the word can change the meaning. I found that quite interesting because I have studied Vietnamese, French, Spanish, and in Vietnamese it is a tonal language. However, in Vietnamese, at least, you have markers on the words to let you know what tone to do. In Swedish, you just have to memorize what the tone is. A lot of words are spelt the same, but are toned different. There are a lot of words that are homophones that sound the same, look the same, but then they mean different things based on context, which is another challenge. The grammar is very difficult as well. So yes, the language can be a challenge, but I do think it's very important that if you come here, you don't have to learn Swedish. Nobody's forcing you to do it, but I do think it is a very important thing, so that's something to consider. Number 10, cultural differences. I've touched on it a little bit throughout this video, but just to go a little further, there are things such as entitle, which basically you can look up that information on it. There's a lot going into that, but everything is supposed to be in balance. Everybody is treated the same. You don't want to do too much or too little. It reminds me of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where everything's just right, everything's logom. I do find that in the modern world it is a bit of a challenge, and on top of that, nobody is the same. There are many different challenges with this. For example, people that tend to be neurodivergent or have a condition like bipolar disorder do find that they struggle a little bit harder, is what I've been told, and that's been my experience as a person who's neurodivergent as well, because everybody's supposed to act the same. I think now in a modern society where more Swedish people are starting to travel abroad and meet people of other cultures, I think that is starting to change. We'll have to see if entitle is here to stay. But things that are very important is you don't brag a lot about yourself. For example, if you're going to go to a job interview, you don't brag about all your accomplishments, whereas in America, that is the expectation. If you don't do that, you may not get the job. You have to sell yourself. Whereas here in Sweden, that is looked down upon. You don't talk about how big your house is. You don't talk about the car that you drive. Whereas in America, that could be a sign of being successful and being good at what you do. Here in Sweden, that is looked down upon. Talking too loud, laughing too loud, being overly happy. I know these things may sound kind of weird, but it is part of the lagom entitle culture. Those are 10 things to think about before making the plunge and jumping in to moving to Sweden. A lot of these things actually apply to other countries as well, in Scandinavia and even just countries in general. Tips are, you need to learn about the culture. You need to check out the weather. You need to make sure you can afford it. Go to that place that you're going to travel to, even if it's not Sweden. Try to get a feel for the surroundings. Make sure it's a good fit for you. Try to stay for an extended period of time if you can. I came to Sweden 3 times before I made the decision of moving here. Also had a lot of friends here, a lot of networking that were able to help me out to come into the system, because it's not easy moving to a new country. It's a huge challenge. And it'd be the same thing, say, if a Swede was going to move to America. There are a lot of challenges in moving to the United States. I know a lot of Swedish people that want to move to the United States, but they find it very difficult. I do feel like it seems to be that Swedes have an easier time adjusting to America than Americans to Swedish culture. I'm not sure really why that is. It's quite fascinating. But yes, so hopefully this was helpful to you. Make sure to like and subscribe if you found this content helpful. It helps me a lot. It doesn't cost you anything, and I really appreciate the support. And have a wonderful rest of your day.